During June 16, 1976, they fractured my nose, locked me up for 586 days in solitary confinement.
We are requesting you to please leave the area as you are giving cause to other incidents. If you continue, you'll be arrested.
I befriended Bob Gosani, who was the top photographer in Drum magazine. And also I had been reading Drum magazine, Time Life magazine, looking at pictures. And I decided that this is me. I should be taking these pictures. So when I joined Drum, there was no job. And I said, no, I can drive. I could post him land whilst I'm driving.
I made a choice that, I'm going to use my camera as a means of communicating the message to the rest of the world. I'm going to use my camera as a weapon. It was a period where the emergence of the alternative media, like the Vrye Weekblad, the Samstaan, Grassroots was up and running, the Weekly Mail. Those were my first focus. It was also the time that I found a home at the Cape Town Press Centre with the late John Rubithon. And through his contacts, the images got out.
The Pollsmoor March, that was the day that I realized, no, here I need to start documenting things that's actually happening within our area. And I said, within our area being the Athlone, Belgravia, Thornton Road, Klipfontein Road area. It was such a hub, such a nucleus of where things were happening in Cape Town. And that's where I met most of the people that I still know today and that I'm still in contact with today.
In Cape Towns, what time did they want the meeting? When we left university, there were different avenues that one looked to go into as an anti-apartheid activist. Just then there was a sort of a chink opening up where it became possible to go into journalism, to use the media as a site of struggle. And that was because of progressive editors like Tony Hurd at the Cape Times, Alistair Sparks at the Rand Daily Mail. So I joined the Cape Times straight out of university and got trained by them as a journalist. In 1983, I was posted to Namibia for 2 years as the bureau chief for South African Associated Newspapers. And that's when I first started photographing news. There weren't any photographers around at that stage. There were photographers, but not ones who were prepared to travel way into the north, into the war zone. I was documenting victims of torture, getting their stories, victims of abuse by Kufut and the military. That's really when it started.
I was called up to the South African Army as a young boy of 17 years old. And it made me very, very aware of what was going on in South Africa. In 1976, I handed in my rifle and I kind of registered as a conscientious objector. But essentially, from that time on, I kind of became a refugee in my own country. I went to study photography, and then the camera became a passport, a means through which I understood the world and actually through which I actually survived and made a living.
Well, it's all Paul Weinberg's fault actually, because I was a member of the Black Sash. And I was working in some of the rural areas. And one day, Paul and I were sitting together in the field, actually, and he said to me, "Why don't you come and join Afripix?" And I had a camera, and I thought, well, this is exactly what I want to do, because I had started taking photographs with the idea of having it there for future reference, and so that people couldn't say we didn't know.
I'd come out of university and then the army, and really wanted to see what was going on in my own country with my own eyes, And I had a number of friends working, for television and newspapers, and particularly foreign television. And so I started taking pictures, following them around, getting myself into places that I wanted to see. I really wasn't interested in photography at all, actually. That took a while. And the main impulse was just to see what was going on.
I started shooting kind of early 80s. I'd been doing a photo course at a place called Community Arts Project, a black and white photo course just as a kind of hobby. But I think that growing up with politics around you, and I was with the UDF area committee in Woodstock, I took a camera and started shooting, and it was kind of in the middle of doing both a bit of journalism and being active at the same time.
We were breaking the Western view of the objective journalist. And our line was that there's no such thing as objectivity when you're fighting something that is as evil as apartheid.
It was better for me to let the world know what is happening in my country. It was better for me to tell what apartheid is, how apartheid functions.
I never saw myself as a photographer. I saw myself as an activist who took photographs.
I think the difference is in the heart you're an activist, but you're also professional.
What set us apart from the foreign press and what's become known as the Bang Bang Club is that we were political activists. We believed in what we were doing because we saw it as what we were doing to fight apartheid. A lot of the foreign media, I think, were probably quite suspicious of us. I think they thought that we were, that we were crazy left-wingers, that we were closet ANC, which a lot of us were.
The news events that grew exponentially in the 1980s were often the founding of an organization. For example, the UDF or domestic workers' trade union. These were very much off the radar. They weren't picked up necessarily by the mainstream press. So we were very conscious of providing this inside voice as, left-wing people ourselves to a broader audience and to what became, the anti-apartheid media throughout South Africa and the world.
It was kind of adopted by COSAS students in Tembisa area. And so I was very comfortable going into Tembisa, and sometimes there were some very hot spots at that time. But I knew I was protected by the comrades. But my work was mainly around the rural areas and around, when it came to townships, it was more around Tembisa and some of the other East Rand areas as well.
I was more conscious about what's happening around me. I had the same values as the activists in terms of how do we free ourselves. I taught a lot in terms of photography, trying to demystify the medium so activists could also use the medium.
A number of us then recognized that we were doing the same things. We had been published in a magazine called Staff Rider. We also recognized that we were photographing the apartheid situation, and that we needed to build some kind of a archive or develop some kind of agency through which we could distribute these images and make our voice just collectively louder. And that was the basis of Afripix that was formed in the early 1980s.
We used to send out a monthly package to various organizations overseas. And then those would go to places in London, in Germany, Sweden, Holland, America. So that's how your photographs got spread around the world.
But we also were critical of exploitation of the situation that is often associated with international photography. If it leads, it bleeds. The more violent, the better. And there was a whole kind of subculture within the international journalists where, it got very, very cynical. How many people died in Soweto today? 10. Wow, it's not a story. 50 people died in Vosloorus. No, that was very difficult fathom and swallow.
How far apart I could set myself from the foreign press, I'm not sure. I mean, I worked for them. I fed that beast, as it were, which was a rather unnuanced view of what was happening in South Africa.
You are now ordered to disperse, and you must start from this place of gathering immediately.
People were very supportive of each other. There was a strong sense of non-racialism, as it were. Particularly interesting because of the period we lived in. We're supposed to be so aware of that, and we were, but in the kind of group we created, those barriers just simply didn't exist. I remember being interviewed by an American journalist who was working for a photography magazine. She said, "Okay, so you guys formed a photographic group. How many of you are black?" And I couldn't think. I said, so I had to sort of then start counting off everyone.
Somehow, the media realized that I lived close by, and that you could actually pull into our yard and you're off the street. So there would be times that they are harassed quite heavily by the police, and I would not be at home, but my mom was always at home. I think everyone knew my mother, from our current ministers down to the media and she entertained them all. Our home was used for meetings, but our home was fairly much a political little hub.
Zubaida and her mother used to feed us all the time. And we used to pop in there, eat there, regroup, change cars, go out. But I dared not go into the township alone, because you had police. If police picked you up on your own, there was a good chance, that you could end up where it was difficult times. And so we were almost forced to go out in groups, meet all the time as a clique and go out in one car. By 10 o'clock in the morning, they would have arrested us in Adil's car. And we changed to Zubaida's car, and we go out in Zubaida's car, then you get arrested in her car, then you go out in Jimmy's car. It was a continuous duck and dive scenario.
There was a kind of solidarity in terms of making sure that none of us get caught. So there was always a meeting point, be it in Athlone or Langa or Guguletu, where we would inform journalists where to meet and go in convoy. There was no cell phones, but there was ways of paging each other. But there was that camaraderie amongst us. And in particular, foreign media, we went out of our way to make sure that they're safe, that they get their pictures so the pictures can get out. So there's that kind of assistance.
The Pollsmoor March in '85, which really was the start of all the conflict. It started off with Belgravia Road, Athlone.
Oyo, man, oyo! And they hit him, it was a European policeman, and they hit the child. She couldn't say anything because she was fleeing for the life of a child.
That's really was the catalyst, was Athlone. in rapid succession. There was the Trojan horse shootings, the conflict in Crossroads started with the Wittuk vigilantes as they wore white strips to distinguish themselves from the so-called comrades, who were mostly the younger militants. They were backed by the police. They set about destroying KTC and New Crossroads and places that were seen as strongholds of the United Democratic Front and, by extension, of the ANC. That was when George de Arth was killed. Not long after that was when the execution of the Gugulethu 7 happened. That is a big story that I covered. And a lot of the big stories we were covering really were funerals, because there'd be something would happen during the week. Somebody would be shot dead by the police or killed by the vigilantes, and then come Saturday, Sunday, there'd be funerals, and then more people would be killed. And it was just this rolling process that just never stopped.
The pluck, the guts the youth had, they were totally fearless. They didn't care. They were militant, and to me, that was a driving force of the 80s. After that, the unions got involved in a lot of activists, but they were fearless. They got killed. They went on a Saturday afternoon. They buried the dead. They made political speeches. They sang the night. They had a gumba just to, music and musicians got involved. But they determined the next morning they go out again. It was quite amazing just how they knew what they wanted, and they were prepared to die, like liberation before education, one of the slogans.
The period evokes a number of images that I think were iconic or symbolic for the time. I remember, for example, 1985 May Day, when May Day was still seen as an illegal day by the South African government. There was a meeting at Khotsa House, and it was broken up by the police, and there's a photograph of a woman challenging the police on the steps of Khotsa House, and the policeman pointing his gun to her head. Those were the sort of moments that we were kind of very primed to catch.
I went out on my own. I took an oldie little handbag. Then, if the police comes and it's like, chaotic and that, I will take my camera, I'll put it in the handbag, and I'll also just be part of the crowd. But eventually, they get to know your face. You are singled out.
What I did was I took a knitting bag with me, and I hid my camera and my film in my knitting bag. And when the police were sort of looking in my area, I would quickly sort of knit, and be unconscious about what was going on. And then when they weren't looking, I would sort of take my camera out and take a few shots and then become this little old lady again.
I knew sort of backways into the major townships like Soweto and Alexander Township. So when the sort of flames were flying and we needed to go in there and photograph, it would be a kind of cat and mouse game, They would set up their roadblocks and I would test my knowledge to see if I could get in, through the backside.
There was always a reason why to be there, and especially with the youth, because I'll be photographing, there'll be some barricades, and there I'll spot my one son and my other son, So I knew they were involved. They were in the SRCs, they were very militant, and those were really amazing, encouraging days, it just got you up going, okay, what's the next story? What's happening? Who's doing what?
The courageousness of students, young people, and also seeing people being killed. And, it's sons, brothers, friends, and it's also people that I knew.
The painful thing was always to see how radical the apartheid government was with African people. If you went into Mitchell's Plain, they had a different set of rules to how they operated in black areas. And I think that was the most painful thing, is watching how they treated people.
Depart from this place of gathering immediately. Die mense van die berg moet die gebied onmiddellik verlaat. Want hierdie polismanne arresteer vir my al hierdie persmense. Kom, move it. All the press. Okay, get that push. Good morning, guys. How are you doing?
During June 16, 1976, they fractured my nose, locked me up for 586 days in solitary confinement. I was banned for 5 years, couldn't speak to more than 3 people at a time, couldn't leave my area, Johannesburg, Soweto. I couldn't leave without permission. They called me the man who doesn't exist, because you could publish my pictures but not mention who they were taken by.
Tear gas was something that happens all the time. It's either shot at us or we caught in with the swing of the wind coming towards us. But the most frightening time was when, it was one of the funerals, when they moved the military in. That was frightening because all of a sudden the army came in, and the army had rifles where the police were shooting tear gas. After that, they were looking for journalists. Now it wasn't the comrades any longer, the journalists, and the community took us through their houses, over the wall, into a car and back to our cars.
But I think we also regarded ourselves to be at war with the apartheid forces, because they just saw us as the enemy all the time. We knew who they were. They knew who we were. We were having daily encounters, daily disagreements, daily fights with them about whether or not we were allowed to be on the scene, because when they decided they were going to take action against the community, they would first get rid of us.
Just leave the area. Leave the area.
Good morning, youth. I will come and arrest you.
That's when you'd go and look for a place to hide, or sit in a car with a long lens, or try and find some kind of way, get out of there and then come around the back, or do something to get an image of what was going on.
They might be coming for us. Someone check the back.
In June 86, when just about everybody was detained, they came to my house, which was in Craighall Park, in the middle of the night, and my son was in the house as well. And they spent about 2 hours going through the house, and then I was kept in Hillbrow Police Station. Yeah.
For how long?
It was 37 days. I think they thought I was taking arms into Tembisa. But I heard this via a neighbour who'd been questioned about me. So I think it was more my activism, it wasn't really my photography.
I remember on one occasion in Duduza, when there had been a funeral and there'd been a spontaneous kind of protest against what had happened. And there was this roaming police car. I pointed my camera to photograph them, and as I photographed them, they shot me. And just missed me.
There was a May Day rally happening in the Zolani Centre. We were outside, the crowd was milling back and forth. It was too big for the actual hall, so people were outside, and the cops started moving in. I was busy photographing the cops, and as always, you try and stand near something that will give you some sort of cover I was standing next to a big blue gum tree. I lifted up, it was in fact this camera with this lens, my 400mm lens, lifted that up and I was looking through it and I saw Warrant Officer Barry Barnard taking aim at me and I ducked and the buckshot hit the tree where I was standing above me. It was a deliberate attempt to kill me. Must have been about 15 seconds, 20 seconds after that they opened fire with a massive volley of tear gas. The one image that stands out for me, there was an Irish nun, Sister Kelly, who was caught by the tear gas and she was lying, vomiting on the ground and trying to comfort another black nun.
The police started shooting and using live ammunition. I was in the road and the next thing, this bullet hits the back windscreen of the car and it just shatters. And you realize that here you need to retreat. And this guy was shot in the stomach. And I won't forget the guts, the inside, the intestines and everything and the blood and
So those were the hairy times, and there were people who did die, and we need to just acknowledge a number of them who did: George de Arth, Abdul Sharif, Ken Oosterbrook, and a number of others.
I never ever, in all my years of covering what is happening, I never felt threatened by the residents of Gugulethu, Khayelitsha, Langa, Yanga crossroads. I felt threatened by the Witduk vigilantes. The people knew us, they sheltered us, they looked after us, they protected us. We were scared of the police, yes.
It sort of happened now and again, where you were either chased or hunted. And it eventually affected me in a way. I got, crowds of people I used to be wary of, the crowd's mood changing and this kind of thing. People, camera was always sort of some kind of intervention. People got aggressive. It freaked me out for a while.
It's more dangerous than it was in '76. Today it has changed. It is both black and white that suffer, because there is nothing like a black photographer. But something is happening out there.
I see this man with a petrol bomb. As was about to throw the bomb, I caught his hand. I took that bottle of petrol away from him. Otherwise, Louise Gap and her friend would have burned to death. I take chances. I tell the people, these people are doing the same work I am doing. And I said, if you do that to me as well.
It's a license to murder, maim and kill our people. Whose interests do you serve? Those of South Africa or those of the revolutionary element?
There were two successive states of emergency that were imposed. Media-wise, it made it very difficult. You were banned from reporting any police action, any military action. You were not allowed to be in the scene or within an area deemed an unrest area.
Can I ask you to leave this area, please? This is a rioted area. You haven't got permission to be here.
Sorry, who's declared it a riot area?
It's been declared a riot area.
We've been out all morning, we haven't seen any riots.
So I'm asking you to leave the area here.
You were not allowed to photograph unrest. You're not allowed to photograph the police. You were not allowed to photograph the military. So we had to find quite innovative ways of doing it. I covered a rally at the University of Cape Town where the police opened fire with birdshot and tear gas. They set dogs on the students, they shambocked some of the students. So what we did was we photographed an empty campus. Jamison Hall steps, we photographed it empty. I then wrote the report that Protesting people who may not be identified were yesterday hit with objects that may not be identified and were sprayed with a chemical substance that may not be identified, and some of them were bitten by animals that may not be identified. We turned it into complete absurdity, and everybody knew exactly what we were writing.
Most times you would shoot an image of someone getting shot in front of you and then rush back to the newspapers and have almost all of them turn you down to publish it because there was a state of emergency. And so I suppose that was almost forced us to go to papers like Grassroots and South and those papers who would publish our stuff.
The police saw the press as a threat. We were the enemy of the state. So we were always the target, and we always tend to be in between, the police and the activists, and in the center, or you behind. You try to find a comfort zone. But certainly there was a lot of detentions, there were a lot of beatings, there was confiscation of film.
My phone was taken away in Alexander Township. The man says to me, open your camera and take out your phone. I said, you must be joking. And he says, I'm not joking. I say, take out your phone and expose it to light. And I said, no. He hit me with the police baton.
The big concern was when they get your phone, they would identify activists and arrest them. And we know it happened. They use it in court cases already. And so personally, that was my whole thing. How do you move your film? Yes, they'll get you with a camera, but there's a new roll of film. We always had little runners with us, who's following, and we'd few photographers would use one, and as you remove a film, you just pass it on. So you never kept film, anything at home. Being raided at the office, you never kept it at the office, so there was always other places you kept your film and your negative.
In 1986, Afripix was raided by the security police, and they confiscated all our material. I thought, well, that's the end of the road, and where do we go from here? The material was used for a trial, the famous UDF trial of the time. At that point, we made a decision in Afripix that every image that we took, we would also send outside the country, so that the archive that we were idealistic about developing earlier on had become a threat.
Yeah, the children, they really just see that our fucking help them.
They were looking for the press, and an old mama hid me and 3 little kids. They must have been 5, maybe 6. They hid us in the toilet in an outhouse, and we heard the cops coming, banging, banging. And they flung open the door, and these kids ran out. And this big white cop, I lifted my camera and I shot him. I photographed him shambocking, whipping these little kids. Done nothing, they were little kids. And I just lost it, and and you can actually see on the top here that, there's a little dent there. And I whacked the cop. It was a Nikon FM, it's solid metal. It's not a plastic camera, it's not a plastic digital camera, it is solid metal. You can hear that. And I just swung it at him, and I knocked him unconscious. And then I ran like hell.
Comrades would use me to put them in touch with the lawyers, or if they were injured, I would take them to hospital. And, so they saw me as a resource, I think. Usually they knew I was coming in, and I would also go in at night and take comrades out and bring them home to sleep as well, so that they'd be safe.
Well, you know, personally, it had a serious impact. Firstly, being emotional to what I'm doing, and what I'm seeing also affected me emotionally. I couldn't just pack up and say, okay, I've got my pictures, I'm filing it, I'm going to have a sleep. But also with your family life, my kids were activists, my kids were arrested. Colin got arrested in '85, Section 29, which is detention without trial. She and a colleague, Jenny Schreiner, Soraya Bas, a whole lot of them. Which means that she was in detention, I was at home, but I also had to work. It got me at one stage drinking a lot, you know, which is, it's also to almost a kind of therapy, which I had to eventually realize that's not the way.
Emotionally, it was very draining. Also, just the repetition of seeing dead bodies, violence, and it was like just a sort of a continual, you know, highlights package that would just replay and replay and replay.
It was extraordinarily violent. I mean, I remember being, you know, quite shocked and amazed. But you know, I was also young, and you know, when one's sort of sense of invincibility is quite strong, and it was exciting. Tragic for a lot of people, but for observers like myself, taking photographs for the first time and working in that sort of intense environment, it was intensely exciting.
You'd come back from this mayhem, killing, chaos, tear gas, and you'd drive down Adderley Street and there were these people just carrying on as normal. You'd go out for a drink after work and there'd be everybody partying it up, and you just want to scream at them, say, do you know what's happening out there?
For me, it sickened me, actually, to be also a kind of voyeur, you know, in this, through the country in this way.
It's losing activists, good people along the way. It's losing good journalists along the way, either getting caught in the crossfire or dying through crime events or in car accidents. It's losing good people who could have contributed so much to our society along the way.
The prohibition of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party and a number of subsidiary organizations is being rescinded. I wish to put it plainly that the government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally.
The happiest times was the release of Nelson Mandela.
It must have been about 300-400 media from all over the world. All of us wanted to move forward as well, you know, to get close, and you knew you couldn't. But it's just our instinct, move forward, although we were given a line.
Listen, I want the media to listen to me right now, all right? We need to protest this situation in group.
Who arranged this?
This is wrong. I mean, this is a historic event. It shouldn't be screwed around with.
I arrive at Victor Verster prison, and there are people who've been waiting there for 3 days, and they're tears of cameramen and journalists. And I try and find a sort of place for myself. There's a lot of resentment.
The guys sleeping and drinking get contacted, and they walk in, and all the guys that work hard all night and stand here get screwed.
I've got a kind of a B-team view of what's going to happen. There's no ways I'm going to get this shot, but I do my best. And I maneuver myself between a Time correspondent and his wife. She is incredibly unpleasant and, you know, starts shouting at me. And she said, I remember she said, I've been waiting here for 8 hours. And this is, you know, really like irritating. And I just turned to her and I said, I've been waiting here all my life. as he goes to like put his fists in the air, there's some comrades on the side here, and they just surge. I go like belly up, and the moment I have of Madiba coming out of Victor Verster is blue sky. That is my shot of Madiba.
Just seeing him walking out in my mind and one eye through the viewfinder, it's also, there's not going to be any more funerals. There's not going to be any more youth getting killed. There's not going to be any more police brutality. You know, it was almost as if the saint has cometh. And I think out of everything that happened, I got one good frame.
I was then the Southern Africa correspondent for CBC Television, that's Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's national television news. And I commentated the release live, watching it on television, the SABC's live feed. So I commentated it live for, I think, 2.5 hours. It was an incredible experience. I actually couldn't, when he walked out, I just burst into tears. I couldn't carry on.
But quite an amazing event to just be able to say, wow, you were there. I mean, you know, wherever you drove back on the way back, there were all these, on the freeway, on the N1, thousands of people on the bridges with flags. I mean, most amazing day.
I can remember the car, the Toyota car that Nelson Mandela and Winnie sat in, drove up, and they realized, and they just continued driving. And I said to them, hey, they're actually on the parade already, but it was like really like an unmarked, insignificant little car. And eventually, it was fairly late when Nelson Mandela then appeared on the balcony. But then I think it was Jesse Jackson. He was around. He arrived with some little limousine and parked like right in front. You can imagine by then people were anxious, waiting and wondering, and people, I think, thought that that was the car. So the sea of people came, and I mean really just emerged, and it was quite chaotic and quite like scary.
I think Jesse Jackson tried to get up the front of the building over the balcony, which he succeeded in doing with a number of hands sort of hauling him over and pushing him up. But he left his car then. I mean, she stood in his car, and I remember my foot going through the windscreen at some point.
Our friends, comrades, and fellow South Africans, I greet you all in the name of peace.
I hardly took photographs that day, actually. I was just so caught up in the joy of it all, yes.
And after that, I was so privileged to have worked with him. I traveled with him on his trip out of South Africa. We went to Lusaka to meet all his comrades there and meet the whole world media. I was his personal photographer on the whole election campaign. And that was very special. And, you know, I had the privilege of being that close to him.
When he did vote in 1994, I was fortunate to be there. I was an official photographer for the IEC. I got him voting for the very first time of his life. So I did get my Madiba moment.
His first day in Parliament, that was it for me. I thought I had enough. I need to get some help, because at that stage it was also, you know, sleepless nights and there's all kinds of things going through. And because music was my therapy, I thought the only thing I should do is to get involved in the community media again. That was my therapy. If that didn't happen to me, I don't know what I would have done.
I decided I'm not doing it anymore. And I chose to work in a completely different way and do softer work. I think with many people there was a burnout, there was a kind of breakdown, if you like. We struggled in those days as other people struggled.
I had quite a lot of withdrawal symptoms, I think, you know, because in many ways you'd had three families that I was part of. I was part of the Sash family, which was a very interesting and fascinating grouping of people. And then I was part of the Afropix family, which was also very interesting to me because I was probably the oldest Afropix member. And then I lost the big Com family, the Comrade family as well, and all that disappeared. And, my purpose to take these photographs seemed to die away, really.
After Mandela's release, during the transition period, I left hard news altogether. I was a travel writer, travel photographer, wildlife photographer, spent a lot of time in the African bush. I eventually came back, some 13 years ago, I came back to the Cape Times. Nothing beats hard news. Once you're a journalist, a hard news journalist, there's just nothing to beat it.
Well, today I shoot mostly around some of the Madiba family and around Arch, mostly. I don't run around like I used to on everything, and so I'm mainly working on a documentary on Arch. I have been for quite a while.
Well, I started working in Central Africa after that period, and then places as far away as Afghanistan and Eritrea. So, I kept going, kept exploring things outside of my own little imaginary realm and finding it intensely interesting. Just from my own personal perspective, one's own personal journey, I think it was more interesting not just to photograph things, but to look at photography in a more embracing way.
Initially on campus, I was a bit frustrated because, you were part of and actively part of this whole 80 period. And it was something that I needed to almost like settle down. I was like tempted to, like the one morning going down Moderdam Road to work, I'm thinking, do I turn around and actually go and do this press conference? And I said, then I'm never going to go back to work. I'm probably going to be fired or something like that. But I suppose, I started there in the 90s. I'm still at CPUT. Now at CPUT, we've combined with Cape Tech.
I have fought very firmly against white domination. I have fought very firmly against black domination. I cherish the ideal of a new South Africa where all South Africans are equal, where all South Africans work together in order to bring about security, peace, and democracy in our country. I sincerely hope that the mass media will use its powerful position to ensure that democracy is installed in this country.
For those of us who believed in non-racialism and the ideal, it started to become very difficult.
This democracy did not come by easy. There's too much money squandering amongst the high offices.
20 years is a long time. 20 years is enough time for somebody to get a chance to show what they can do. And you do have concerns when you look around you with South Africa today.
I feel very sad, very sad. I'm actually more depressed now about South Africa than I have ever been in my whole life. I've always was very upbeat about South Africa because it's had a vibrancy, it had a sense of knowing that it could achieve something really remarkable. I think they're happy for us to do charity work, but I don't think they're happy for us to be activists any longer.
For me, the disappointment is when I look at the people that's in parliament or that's in government structures and that. And I think to myself, the values you had in the 80s. It was absolutely phenomenal, and how you've been sucked into the bad karma that's actually very rife in our society at the moment. The protest then was for freedom. The protest now is about disillusionment.
For many people it's disappointing. The struggle is not over, and we've got to continue fighting for the ideals that we really invested so much in and hoped for.
I get very angry when I see the way in which money is stolen by corrupt politicians. When I see some of the corruption that's happening, when I see some of the fat cat stuff that's happening, people getting rich through politics, makes me very angry, but we'll continue exposing it. That's what our job is.
Well, you know, we've gone since our first elections and our first democracy with a very strong and a fair and one of the best constitutions in the world. There is a lot to be done, a luta continua. I think we've achieved a lot, and I think we all got to be part of a process. Rather than complaining, you've got to say something. Being an activist then doesn't mean you're not activist now. Your role just changed.
We are giving you 3 minutes at 16:26. You must have disintegrated. Thank you very much.